I'm sure you've heard it before. An older person or couple has a car for sale that supposedly has only been driven to church on Sunday and maybe to the store once a week. Kind of reminds me of the Andy Griffith Show when Barney is saved up to buy his first car and ends up with this lemon from a seemingly honest little old lady. Anyway, it was time for my older brother to purchase his first car. Right around this time, we learned that a neighbor of my grandparents were ready to sell their 1950 Ford, similar to the one pictured, but without the high gloss shine. The finish on their car had lost its luster over the years and was more of a dull gray. But it appeared to be in good condition, and my grandparents, who lived directly across the street and had known them for many years, could attest to the fact that, as far as they knew, the car was used very little and that this old couple was as honest as the day is long. As you'll find out, unlike the car that Barney got for his hard-earned cash, this one turned out to be a pretty good deal. Let me tell you the story. This was probably around 1960 or 61. So Dad and my brother journeyed over to their house to take a look. I was a lad of maybe 9 or 10 and tagged along. We ended up buying the vehicle. Don't know what kind of deal was made, but Dad was always known to be a fair negotiator. Anyway, the car starts easily, and we start the trip back home, a distance of about 7 or 8 miles, with the new purchase. About halfway, one of us, not sure who, noticed that the gas gauge pointed right on E. Now, I later learned that on a Ford of 1960s vintage, that meant you still had about a quarter of a tank. Low, but not critical, especially since we were in the city where there was a gas station within about a half mile of anywhere you might be. And the gauges on a 1950 model were probably calibrated about the same. But why did they sell us the car without much gas in it, at least without telling us? So we stopped at the next gas station. This one was at a spot I later remember thinking was at a bad location on a main street, but at the cross street of a residential road, not at a main intersection where most stations back then were. In fact, some intersections had stations competing on all 4 corners, but it must have been an okay location for them as they were still in business many years later. But in those days, it didn't seem like you needed to do a lot of business to stay in business, unlike today when a small drop in sales can result in a store closing. Anyway, we stopped for gas. Remember, this was the early 60s. Most stations were truly service stations where they worked on cars as well, and most everything they sold was automotive related. No convenience store attached. At most, there might be a few vending machines where you could get a pop, usually a small 6 or 7 ounce bottle or a candy bar or cigarettes. And it was still full service as far as the gasoline. Self-serve pumping your own gas was not a thing yet. The attendant would pump the gas, clean your windows, check your oil and air in your tires, the whole deal. So he comes to window and is told to fill her up. Most always you wanted to fill up. At a price per gallon hovering up and down at between just 25 and 30 cents a gallon throughout the 60s. It was hardly worth the trouble stopping for any less. Gas was even cheaper during gas price wars, but that's a story for another video. So, he starts the pump, but it sounds like it stops pretty quickly. Maybe the automatic shutoff kicked in sooner than it should have, but we wait for him to finish the rest of his routine. He fiddles with the nozzle for a few seconds, then comes back to the driver's window. "That'll be 25 cents, he announces. Turns out we had nearly a full tank to start with, not an empty one. The problem wasn't having an empty tank. The problem was that the gas gauge wasn't working. Anyway, we thanked him, paid up, and drove off. Don't know if the problem was electrical or with a sensor in the tank, but it never did get fixed. Brother just kept track of his mileage in a small notebook he kept in the car as long as he owned it, so he would know when it was time to fill her up. Now, at this point, it was still okay and not yet uncool to chauffeur your little brother around, so I was often a passenger in this 1950 Ford. A trip we often made was just to go past the local McDonald's to see if they had changed their number of hamburgers sold sign since a few days earlier. One time I vividly remember was when he made a quick left turn onto our dirt and gravel road from the main road. There wasn't as much in the way of safety equipment in cars in the 1960s, much less in a 1950 model. No airbags yet, and no seat belts, which probably would have been of value in what was to happen next. I was in the front passenger seat, kind of leaning up against the door, when suddenly it flies open and I nearly fall out. I grabbed the door handle before I fell to the ground, but that was a harrowing experience I remember to this day. The door latch mechanism had simply not latched properly, but a bit of graphite applied after that freed it up and solved the problem. But all in all, I think this old workhorse of a vehicle turned out to be pretty reliable. But then it came time that he wanted something sportier, so he moved on to a mid-60s Pontiac he called the Poncho. Maybe someday I'll tell you more about that, and also about my first car, a 1962 Ford Falcon that cost me all of $50 back around 1968 or 1969. This is Big Gare signing off and hoping to see you again soon.